Now, just a little warning before we begin, there will be major spoilers in this video for the 8th episode of Andor, so if you have not seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so before diving into the episode itself, I again have to say how much I am loving and enjoying this series, how truly impressed I am by, well, pretty much everything in regards to it. My only real gripes at this point with the series are the lack of aliens. It does feel like a galaxy comprised almost entirely of humans with a handful of aliens sprinkled in here and there, and those aliens do nothing but stand in the background most of the time. And the use of what you could call Earth terminology from time to time is a little jarring, maybe moderately annoying, I guess, but not something I would call a deal breaker by any stretch. Other than that, and sure some minor nitpicks here and there, there's no real complaints that I have with the show. No big flaws in the writing itself, or that it blatantly is breaking the lore, or completely reframing legacy characters. There's nothing major to complain about, like with certain other previous Star Wars shows. Andor is just solid through and through, even if you find it boring or not very Star Wars-like, and if that's you, that's fine. I'm not saying everyone has to enjoy this. But even if you simply do not like what it is difficult to argue against there being some truly quality writing here. And I mean, going into the series, I had hoped this was going to be a pleasant surprise, that this was going to be Star Wars taken to a different level, you could say, one that was a bit more intricate, complex, and mature, that took itself seriously in different ways than previous Star Wars has. Because, yes, Star Wars oftentimes does take itself seriously. It usually has a lot more to it than immediately meets the eye, if you will, or there's something of substance under the flashy surface. But in the case of Andor, I mean that it takes itself seriously more from the ground up. Serious as in terms of the very functionality of the galaxy itself, which is one of the things I've enjoyed the most so far. That this feels like a real practical galaxy, like we understand how and why things work in it, from, again, that ground level, or the logistics behind everything. For example, in The Rise of Skywalker, we see that the Sith Eternal was able to make a fleet of thousands of Death Star destroyers on an apparent bleak, and for all we know, virtually inhospitable planet, in the middle of a spatial anomaly that only two known devices, both of which are lost, that only they could navigate through. And if we asked J.J. Abrams the logistics behind all of that, how they pulled it off, how they got the raw materials there, and how they kept their workforce fed, how they found a workforce, I'm pretty sure he'd either give you a BS answer or just shrug and say, I hadn't really thought about that. While in Andor, it feels like there is thought given to everything that we see in the show, that Tony Gilroy thinks logically about how and why things work before including them. And don't get me wrong, Star Wars is a blend of sci-fi and fantasy, right? I'm, for the most part, or within reason, I'm going to be okay with things being interesting over being explainable or practical, right? I don't always need airtight science and logic for everything, but I'd like there to be at least a little consideration of the logics or the logistics behind these things to some degree. Anyway, all I'm saying here is that Lucasfilm and Disney, or Tony Gilroy and everyone responsible for making the show, they brought their A game and proved they can create something that is taken to a whole other level in the Star Wars galaxy. And though sure, as I said, not everyone has to love this, not everything has to be like this going forward, there's simply no denying this doesn't feel like content for the sake of content like some other recent shows have felt like. This isn't taking a legacy character and exploiting the name for views while putting in minimal effort because you know people are going to watch it regardless. This is taking essentially a no-name character and putting in more effort than has been put in anything else before it, I think, and needs to be a trend going forward in the franchise if it's truly going to return to prominence. You have to continue to make the best shows you can make, not put in just enough effort to keep people watching. All that said, let's talk about this episode, and instead of just going through it scene by scene this week, I'm going to kind of lump the scenes together into the individual story threads and talk about it that way, instead of jumping around from one to the other, then back and forth again, which I guess you could almost say is a complaint about this episode, that it does jump around a lot and there's a lot going on. There are a lot of moving parts, and if you haven't been paying close attention, you might find yourself a bit lost at this point. And don't get me wrong, that is not a personal complaint. I love when a show trusts its audience to keep up, when there is plenty of subtlety and nuance that is easily missed if you are not paying attention. But anyway, setting that aside, at the start of this episode, we see Andor is being hauled off to prison. We see those that were sentenced at the end of last week's episode, and how they were getting exaggerated or super long sentences for, in some case, literally doing nothing wrong, all thanks to what happened on Aldhani, all thanks to the Empire cracking down on the people in order to keep peace and keep order in their empire. Anyway, we see them, the prisoners, being divided up and sent to different prisons based on what planet they are from and what skills that they likely have, which maybe explains why there are no aliens in the prison Andor is going to be sent to. They keep all humans together because, I don't know, shared languages and shared needs, essentially. You know, more or less all humans require the same environmental conditions and food and such. No special accommodations would be required is basically what I'm saying. I guess it could also be that the Empire thinks humans should not mix with other species because, well, the Empire itself doesn't allow many aliens within their ranks either. They are kind of xenophobic. And yes, I realize I am making excuses for the show and its lack of aliens, which again is one of my big gripes. And that many other races are basically humans with green skin or something, or a few head tails or whatever else it might be. So there really isn't any reason to not mix them, I think. Either way, we see Andor get to the prison run by, again, the Empire, which is kind of ironic considering what this episode is really all about, or what every other story thread is about in this episode, is looking for Andor. And here he is, the Empire already has him and doesn't know it. He's exactly where they want him to be, you could say, and he's in the very last place the rebels want him to be, considering what he knows and what he could tell them. Anyway, in this prison, we learn that the floors can be electrified, basically, that there's 3 different levels, 1 being just painful and 3 being terminal, that the inmates aren't allowed to wear footwear of any kind, while the guards wear these, well, they wear these kind of funky-looking boots that immediately took my mind back to the shoes that we see in Back to the Future 2 when Marty is in the future, even though that future is now our past, but whatever. And I gotta say, I do like this system that the prison has come up with. It makes a ton of sense. You can basically stop every prisoner in the entire prison in their tracks at any time by simply electrifying the entire floor. This goes back to what I was saying before about logic and logistics. This is an interesting futuristic design, you could say, but when you actually stop and think about it, would someone actually design a prison this way? You come back with yeah, I think they would design something like this. Moving on, at one point when Andor is being processed, we kind of learn that the prison is short-staffed, that someone is late because they had something else to do, and we, and more importantly Andor, learn that there are different levels of priority. Andor also learns some terminology and general procedures here, all of which I'm going to guess will come in handy later at some point, or when he and maybe others kind of make some sort of escape effort. And on a bit of a side note, I liked when they got dropped off and the door to the outside world was shutting and the other inmate tells Andor or Cassian to basically take his last breath of fresh air, that it is the last one he'll be taking in quite some time, which kind of ties into the whole story of this episode for Andor, that he starts out trying to kind of argue his case still, that he did nothing wrong, that this is not his fault, that he shouldn't be here. And yet soon enough we'll see him at multiple different times, especially on that first day, in this complete state of disbelief that he can't believe what's going on. He can't figure out how he got here. He can't quite comprehend yet that this is what his next 6 years will look like, that he has taken his last breath of fresh air, and that he literally won't even see beyond the walls of this prison until, again, those 6 years, or however long he gets stuck here, is up. Then after 30 shifts go by, and even though we don't see the number on his little screen change, we don't see his time going down, we see though that he is kind of adapting and accepting his fate. On the outside at least, he's doing what he has to do. He's playing by the rules, he's playing the game, though on the inside, certainly there is still a lot of turmoil. And of course what he has to do is work. They're building, I don't know, some type of ship part or something. I don't think it's too relevant what they're making. The point is that they're building the same part over and over and over again, day in and day out, all the while competing with other teams. Again, this is like a game. They're competing in this room, and the whole floor is competing against the other floors or the other rooms. And that the winner of this particular room gets flavor in their food, and the losers get punishment. They get fried. And yet again, this is absolutely brilliant. This is something that isn't just interesting or cool for the sake of being interesting and cool with no actual thought put into it, but one that makes a hell of a lot of sense. That's actually a quite brilliant way to run a prison. I'm not saying it's the most humane way, I'm simply saying that from the Empire's perspective, it's brilliant. You have limited prison staff, so one of the best ways to keep those prisoners in line and from rising up in any sort of organized fashion is to pit them against each other, to keep them fighting with each other or competing against each other, seeing each other as opponents rather than potential allies. You also then have the floor boss, or in this case, or in their room, Kino being played by none other than Andy Serkis, who, yeah, played Snoke in the sequels, and let's not start any crazy theories about how Kino becomes Snoke. Anyway, you also have this floor boss who is basically on the guard side, right? Or is on the side of the Empire, you could even say. He is so close to going home, and he just cares about himself. He just wants to get out of there and would no doubt turn any one of them in or do whatever he has to stop any sort of revolt, which is what he basically says to Andor when he introduces himself. He doesn't care about you. He just cares about what I can get out of you in order to get myself somewhere else. All in all here, they want every prisoner in this prison to feel isolated and alone and like they can't trust anyone else. Again, they don't want any kind of cooperation. They want them to be at odds with each other. Though that said, it's not like all of them are going to want to play the game. Some of them, yes, are going to get along. Some of them are going to become friends. We even have the one that kind of stands up for Cassian when he joins the team, telling the other one to call him by his name, call him Keef. And this is, of course, a character that will later show up in Rogue One, a very fun, interesting connection. I'm going to guess he's going to be part of whatever escape plan Cassian or whoever comes up with in a future episode. We also learn that there is some level of communication between the different rooms or the different floors or different levels, and there is a lot of different floors and levels, as we see at one point when we kind of get a broader shot of the facility or the inside of the facility. Not to mention, we see that there are multiple facilities when Andor is being flown in. Anyway, there's some kind of hand or sign language being used to talk to each other. Don't think these messages are anything beyond, hey, what's new with you guys over there? But they could be, and likely will be eventually, considering Andor's interest in noticing this kind of sign language. They will be used to communicate some type of organized escape effort at some point, I'm going to assume. But for now, again, I think they just pass what little news they get from the outside world from floor to floor or room to room. We at one point see the day Cassian arrives, everyone is kind of asking him about the PORD, or the Public Order Resentencing Directive, which has doubled all of their sentences. They're expecting and hoping with their line of questioning that it is a major story outside of the prison, that everyone out in the real world is talking about it and how outrageous it is and how unfair it is and that it is going to be repealed. But Andor has never heard of it because no one's talking about it, which kind of crushes the hopes of all these inmates. Along with this, they also seem to know about what happened on Aldhani, or they know a version of it. We hear at one point one of the prisoners mention that they, the rebels, slaughtered a garrison there. Which we know isn't exactly what happened. We know, yes, some Imperials were killed, but it's either being exaggerated as it's passed along in the prison, or more likely that the Empire itself is the one doing the exaggerating for the sake of propaganda, for the sake of making the rebellion look like monsters, and thus justifying their drastic measures in response. We even have Perrin later on talking about how the rebels should have thought about these consequences before they went and blew up a Imperial base on Aldhani, which again kind of implies that the news out there, or what the Empire is saying, is that the rebels have done something more drastic than what they actually did. Anyway, some of these prisoners seem to be not so happy about the rebellion and how they are paying the price for it. And someone else, in a way, that is paying the price for what Andor and the others did, that job on Aldhani, is Andor's mother, Marva. We see in this episode that she is kind of falling ill, and she literally fell and hurt herself after trying to do some rebel activity, basically. That she has been so inspired by what Cassian and the others did, not that she knows it was Cassian, that she's going to do her part in this rebellion however, or whatever she can, even if it literally kills her. Which I think it will while Andor is in prison. I think he'll escape somehow and go home to see her, only to find out that she is dead and that Bix has been taken away and imprisoned by the Empire as well. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that after seeing what the Empire is doing, starting to get the full scope of things, that this will push Andor closer to being a kind of true rebel, to fighting for the cause instead of just fighting for himself, as he's always done before. We are seeing kind of the shift in Andor in this prison. He's really beginning to understand just how bad the Empire is. Moving on, we almost, and I think we will eventually still get it, we almost got my dream tag team or power couple to come together in this episode, and I'm of course talking about Dedra and Cyril. Those two are made for each other, they just don't know it yet. But in all seriousness, we saw Cyril going about his daily boring routine at the Bureau of Standards, the job he got thanks to good old Uncle Harlow, when the Empire shows up and drags him back to the ISB headquarters for continually searching for information about Andor. And I just love how we see Cyril shaking his foot all nervously. He's got to be both kind of excited that they're potentially taking him seriously and that he maybe has this chance to sort of redeem himself after Ferrix, which he so desperately wants. And yet he's also got to be kind of afraid that they're just going to throw him in prison for digging around where he shouldn't. Either way, for better or worse, Deidre doesn't take him or his information all too seriously. She doesn't think he can be of much use, which is when we finally see Cyril stand up and really say something or defend himself, to say that he can help her and that he can be a use to the Empire. And he so desperately wants to feel helpful and useful to someone or something, considering the way his mother treats him, like he can't even take care of himself, that he can't tie his own proverbial shoes or be of any use in the most basic of ways, right? He's really a man looking for some self-worth. Unfortunately for him, she rejects him, which I don't think is going to stop Cyril, despite being threatened that he'll be talking to someone else, someone worse, should he keep inquiring or digging for Andor, which again, I think he absolutely will. I have to believe that eventually, some way, somehow, he is going to end up in the Empire and will help them track down Andor, even though Andor is currently imprisoned. He's currently right under their nose. Moving on then with Deidre, or Dedra as she kind of pronounces it, we see her at yet another ISB meeting where Yularen is essentially not listening so much to her. He's just kind of sitting there pretending he's listening and saying he is. Which, I don't know, this is one of those minor little nitpicks I have, that I don't know that this feels like the character. I don't know that this feels like the same guy from the Clone Wars that we see with Anakin. Though yes, that will be roughly 15 years ago at this point, so who knows how much he's changed in this time. And he has to have changed to some degree, right? Because in the Clone Wars, he seemed like a pretty good guy, if you will. Yet here he is leading the ISB. Either way, Dedra, with a little help from Cyril, heads to Ferrix and takes Pac into custody. And he's the guy who runs the shop that has the radio or transmitter that was allowing Bix to communicate with Luthen. And the Empire, or mainly Dedra, along with looking for Andor, they're looking for Luthen. She's looking for Luthen, though she doesn't know that exactly yet. She doesn't know who Luthen is. She just calls him Access, because he seems to be some sort of centralized figure that is organizing the rebellion and distributing stolen Imperial tech to them. So she figures if she can dig deep enough and find him, she can kind of snuff out the rebellion at its root. And we do see again, or more in this episode, how Luthen is kind of that central figure she suspects him to be. We see this when he visits Saw Gerrera, and that's a scene I absolutely loved. I thought it was awesome seeing them both trying to work out if the other one had pulled off the job on Aldhani, and keep saying, well, now I'm sure you're the one because of what you just said, even though we of course know Luthen is the one behind it. And it played really, really well into the whole theme of the scene, how they trust each other and they work together, they have shared goals, a shared objective, more or less, yet they don't trust each other and they don't really work together, and their goal is kind of maybe a little different. Which is the rebellion's greatest weakness right now, which is pointed out by Saw, that they have all these different cells, all of which they call themselves different things, and they fight in different ways and for kind of different reasons. They don't all trust each other or want to work together. They don't really all see themselves as being on the exact same team. And in this odd sort of way, or using extreme measures, Luthen is trying to get them all on the same page by, just in general, growing everyone's hatred of the rebellion. His line that oppression breeds rebellion is fantastic. It's so true. The more you take away from someone, the more likely they are to stand up and fight to try to get it back. Or at least that's the hope for Luthen here. But going back to Ferrix and Dedra now, we see her capture and bring in Bix after having interrogated Pac, the aforementioned shop owner. And I loved how Dedra wanted Bix to see Pac, or what's left of him, sitting in the chair before she herself welcomed her to sit in that same chair. Perfect way to start the interrogation off on the right foot to put the fear into Bix. Also on Ferrix we see Cinta and Vel, which means Cinta did whatever she was still doing on Aldhani, and in the last episode we see her riding a speeder around as a Star Destroyer shows up overhead. Whatever she did, she got off planet without any major hitch, it seems. Now she's going to sit and wait for Andor to potentially show up on Ferrix so she can most likely just kill him and tie up a loose end. And I really enjoyed the brief scene between them, how we see Val is running from her rich family, as Cinta so bluntly pointed out when she said she'd pretend to be a rich girl running from her family if anybody asked who she was, and Val very much took offense to that, implying that is her story. And I do think, as I talked about last week, there is a good chance that the family she is running from is Luthen. I think Vel is likely his daughter, and something happened to or with Vel's mother that made her leave. We even have something like this alluded to with Luthen, that something has happened to him as Saw is questioning him or asking him who you are. And he doesn't mean like literally who you are, what is your name. He means, what are you doing here? Why are you in this fight? Why are you the one trying to organize this rebellion? What is your story? Anyway, going back to Vel and Cinta, this is a rather interesting dichotomy between them, where we have Vel running away from her family and looking for something more in someone else, whereas Cinta, we know, has lost her family. They were killed by stormtroopers, and she is looking to avenge them. She is in the fight for someone else. And as Cinta says, the struggle will always come first, and basically Vel gets to have whatever is left of her after that. Whereas Vel, it seems, would probably give up the mission or give up the struggle and the fight and run off with Cinta if she would only give the word. And there is almost certainly a tragic ending in store for these two, which is sad and unfortunate because they have been done really well. I'm rooting for them, but I really don't like their odds. The final sort of story thread in this episode to check in on is then with Mon Mothma, which, kind of treads water in this episode. Not a whole lot happens with it. We see Mon talking with Tay. Again, that's the banker she hopes can help her move her money around, is also sort of a childhood friend. And that Perrin also doesn't seem, her husband, Mon's husband, doesn't seem to be a huge fan of Tay. Go figure. We also learn that Mon and Perrin were married in the tradition of Chandrila, their homeworld, at a rather young age. Mon was only 15 at the time, and then they moved to Coruscant, and Mon became a senator at the age of 16. And you kind of have to wonder if there's some resentment from that from Perrin, that her career kind of took over or took precedence over his and squashed whatever dreams or ambitions he may have once had. Who knows? Though, yes, we do know that Perrin served in the military in some capacity, probably during the Clone Wars. He's mentioned before that he kind of has these old military buddies that he keeps up with. Either way, we see yet another lavish party, the rich elite casually discussing the problems of the common folk in the galaxy and what they should do about it. And Mon Mothma, as we know, genuinely does care. She is one of the good ones. She is risking herself to try to stop Imperial overreach. Someone else, one of the other senators, then makes the comment as they are discussing the Imperial overreach, that if you don't do anything wrong, you have nothing to fear. Basically saying it doesn't matter how harsh the punishments are, it can simply be avoided by not breaking the law, by not doing anything wrong. And Mon's response to that is absolutely perfect when she says, "I'm fearing your definition of wrong," meaning the one who decides what is right and what is wrong then has all the power, especially if they can arbitrarily deem what you're doing is wrong and punish you on a whim. Which is what we essentially see happen to Cassian, that he's sitting in prison while, again, the rich elite discuss these issues, not fully understanding, or in some case, caring about the real impact on real people right now. And sure, Andor obviously broke the law when they pulled the Aldhani job, but that's not what he's imprisoned for. As he says when he shows up, he's asked by the other inmate why he is in there, and he says he did nothing. And the other inmate says that there is a lot of that going on lately. This episode then ends with Andor and his team doing their thing. He's, as kind of talked about before, he's on the outside at least, accepted his fate and is playing the game. And again, this place is brilliantly designed. It's meant to pit the inmates against each other to keep them worried about each other and working as fast and as efficiently as possible for the chance to win some flavor in your food over trying to fight back in any way, shape, or form. Which we know will eventually happen. We know Andor is going to somehow get out of this place sooner rather than later. He can't spend 6 years here. That would move past the events of Rogue One. So in closing, I'll just quickly say that this was another fantastic episode. I can't say enough good things about the series and my complaints, though they do exist. Again, there's a real lack of aliens. They do not take away or diminish the show enough to be something I find to be a real issue. And though I know there are people who don't like this, who find it boring or not Star Wars-y enough, for me, this has raised the bar. This has shown what Star Wars can be, which isn't to say it should all be like Andor from henceforth, only that it should always be handled by people who are willing to go the distance to create something this great. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this episode or what you are thinking of the series overall. Are you loving it? Are you hating it? Do you fall somewhere in between? Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.